The .NET Core podcast is supported by our listeners who have become patrons. To see a full list of the patrons, or to join them, head over to .NETCore.show/patrons. Hello everyone and welcome to the .NET Core podcast, an award-winning podcast where we reach into the core of the .NET technology stack and, with the help of the .NET community, present you with the information that you need in order to grok the many moving parts of one of the biggest cross-platform, multi-application frameworks on the planet. I am your host, Jamie Progman Taylor. In this episode, I talked with Dave Glick about Statiq, which is a static site generator written in .NET. Although calling it a static site generator, as we'll see, is rather quite reductive. We also talk about the Jamstack, static sites, and how most websites don't actually need something like ASP.NET Core or WordPress generating pages at request time. We also talk about a very small selection of some of the things that you can use Statiq to generate. So why not check it out today? Along the way, Dave dispels some of the common misconceptions of statically generated versus dynamically generated. That's generated ahead of time versus generated at request time. And I talk about how the website for this show is generated ahead of time, and some of the benefits that the community of listeners get from that. This is a conversation that both Dave and I could have kept going for hours, but we've both agreed to come back to it another day in order to explore it a little further. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. Thank you, Dave, for spending some time with me today and with the listeners as well. I really, really appreciate it. I think we're going to be talking about something that a lot of .NET devs don't really think about, especially in the web space. There's ASP.NET servers that serve your website and your web APIs and stuff, and a lot of people are used to that sort of, there is a server that I put a request in, it builds a page and brings it back. And we're technically not going to talk about that. So that's going to be an interesting diversion for people, I think. But before we do any of that, why don't you tell the folks a little bit about yourself, right? And like I said, welcome to the show.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, Jamie. And good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you happen to be listening. So my name is Dave Glick. I have been developing on .NET for well over a decade at this point, way back pre-.NET 2.0, which is kind of when things got fun. I do a lot of open source development, have several open source projects. I'm active with the Cake Build team, and just generally like to participate in the .NET open source community. And kind of as an aside, I'd encourage anyone listening out there who's interested in open source to hit me up or look up some of the other active .NET open source folks, and we can help you get started. But today, that's not what we're talking about directly. We are talking about some open source projects, however. So that's a little bit about me in general.
Yeah, thanks for that. I always find it's really useful for people to sort of, for the listeners to sort of level set and go, well, who is this person, right? Because the last thing you want is someone who's an expert at something coming on and saying, I'm not going to tell you anything about me. I'm just going to tell you about the thing that I'm an expert in. And that's great, but obviously there's the personability of it, right?
Oh, sure, yeah. So I will tell you, I consider myself an expert at nothing, always learning. We are all sort of experts in waiting at just about everything, I think. Yep.
I'll agree with you there. I'm the furthest from an expert than anyone could be. I'm definitely a Wally, is how we would say it in UK parlance. I'm not sure whether Wally has the same feeling over in the States, but
it does not. I've never even heard that term. I like it. I must start using it.
Fair enough. There you go. I do know that when the Where's Wally, or rather Where's Waldo books were brought over to the UK, they renamed the character Wally. I don't know whether it had anything to do with
Oh,
it.
that's interesting. That's a fascinating little bit of history there. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's Where's Waldo in the States and Where's Wally over here in the UK, which I've never really understood, but I'm not in the business of localization, so they know what they were doing, and that's perfectly fine for me. But yeah, so I reached out to you because there's this wonderful open source project that you've been working on, and just saying open source project is doing it a disservice because there's a whole bunch of stuff that it does. I know of it as a static site generator, and this is your project Statiq, right? And for the listeners, you've all been browsing a static website, a statically generated website, if you've gone to the website for the podcast, because it's statically generated. That doesn't mean that it doesn't change. It just means that my definition of it is that the HTML is generated ahead of time, and so you don't have a server sitting there, receiving a request, generating a page, building that on the server whilst we're waiting, and then sending that back over the wire. And that was purely from I hate to say it, but a security standpoint. That's why I chose a statically generated website, because there's no server. You can't. All right, there is a server, but there's no like server infrastructure.
Yeah, it's got like a tiny little attack
Yeah.
surface that's been abstracted away.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, security is certainly one very good reason why people lean towards static websites. There are others. Performance is another good one. A lot of times because the resources and the content have been pre-generated, you can push it out to very low resource servers like edge servers or content delivery networks, and it can get to the users a little bit faster since there's no processing that needs to be done. But let's back up just a minute and talk about what a statically generated website actually is.
Sure.
Yeah, because that's so we'll rewind kind of back to the very beginning here. And a statically generated website is a website where all of the things that come down to the web browser, to the client, have been pre-built. That could be HTML, but it could also be JavaScript. It could be images. It could be other resources. Essentially, you take the web server out of the picture and you do the work that the web server would normally do beforehand. Now, there's some challenges and tricks to that. It's kind of a different way of looking at things. For one, it means that you have to do the work that the web server would do for every possible endpoint and combination of query strings and requests, which is certainly doable. I think people would be surprised how many websites you visit on the modern web that are either wholly or partially statically generated. There are a number of very large-scale sites that have lots of dynamic content that are being delivered to you as static resources, kind of in their initial form. Stack Overflow is one that comes to mind. They do a lot of what's called edge caching, which is a form of static generation where you generate things once and then save it. Amazon statically generates a lot of their product pages and then augments those during a request. Another thing to keep in mind is that a statically generated website does not mean static content or static user interface. What a lot of people do is statically generate the web resources and then create a dynamic API that can be called to populate that. That model is often what's called the Jamstack, which you may or may not have heard, and is kind of gaining traction as a term for this sort of statically generated website. The Jamstack is a stack with the three letters standing for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And it's kind of the bare minimum that you would need to create a statically generated site that has dynamic content on it through the use of APIs and JavaScript. essentially moving the processing from what was traditionally on a web server to the user's web browser, which solves a lot of problems, right? Coming full circle, security being one of them. If you don't have a web server sitting there executing things, there's no attack surface.
Definitely. And it's one of the reasons why I sort of fell in love with the Jamstack, right? I'm by no means a security expert, but if you show me a way to increase the security of something, or indeed to decrease the attack surface of something, I'm going to be super interested. And when I started hearing about Jamstack 2-3 years ago, I was like, this is it. This is it for me. All of my any kind of blog or anything like that, right? I'm surprised by every time I hit a website that's powered by WordPress, Ghost, whatever, any of these sort of dynamically generated CMS-based websites, I can tell when I've woken the server up because it'll take 5 or 6 seconds for it to start responding. I'll hit the page and then there's nothing for 5-6 seconds and then it says loading, right? Because I've just poked at the server and woken it up. Whereas with a statically generated website, all it's doing is serving the HTML. Right? There's loads of other stuff that you can do. Like you said, you can make it dynamic, but all it is serving is the HTML. So there's nothing to poke and wake up, right? It's like an Nginx or an Apache server. It's nothing.
Yeah, and a lot of times the web hosts that specialize in hosting static content, the Netlify and the GitHub pages, those kind of web hosts are, they're often have, thousands of sites on these highly optimized delivery systems whose only job is to check out the endpoint or the route that you're calling and return back the static content that happens to live at that route. So you can see how that's both easy to optimize and removes any sort of security burden off of you. I mean, not that those systems themselves have to be secured, but it's not your problem anymore. Because it's one system doing one thing, and that thing is very simple. It's easy for those hosts to then harden those systems well beyond what could be done with a standard style web host.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I touched on it earlier. Blogs, like you said, that kind of thing is kind of a perfect candidate for static generation. But you can go bigger than that too. Really, any site where the number of views that a user might look at is well defined and well bounded could, in theory, be statically generated, even if that number is in the tens of thousands due to like factorial style combinations. As long as you can define those combinations and figure out exactly what the page should look like, you can statically generate it and stick it on a static host. And then augment with JavaScript and APIs as needed. A pattern I've seen is folks statically generating JSON files and then serving those as a static resource as an API, so to speak. And that then creates all kinds of possibilities if your statically generated site with statically generated JavaScript loads your statically generated JSON and can do things like grids with filtering and paging. And, the world's the limit there in terms of your imagination, how you can use that. So there are very few sites that really aren't possible with stack generation. Now, of course, there's always a trade-off too. There's how hard is this going to be to statically generate? How many resources will I need to output? When that number gets into like the millions, you start to say, well, okay, maybe this isn't practical for this model. Every tool in the toolbox has a use.
But like you said, you can augment with, you mentioned filtering and, sorting and paging and stuff. We would do that with JavaScript anyway. And so it's like all you're doing, like let's say you build a ASP.NET MVC application that shows an e-commerce website, right? And it has a page list of products. you could have a server that generates that page, and it generates the paging control, and then you hit next on the paging control. It's going to make a JavaScript API call and get the content to display on screen, and then it's going to replace that content either via a partial or via Blazor, which we can talk about later, or via actually using JavaScript and replacing the DOM elements. Well, you don't need in that instance, you don't need the ASP.NET MVC server to show you that page initially, right? Because you've just proven that you can put the request in and get the content to display on screen through an API. So the amount of times that I've said to people where I've been like, this could be a static website, and they go, no, because I need that interactability, and I'm like, you can still have that,
Yeah, I think and even when you're using a Jamstack model that includes a server with an API, I personally find that splitting my site and my front end bits into this totally separate thing that I can generate beforehand, deploy to a CDN, mirror geographically, that separating that out from my API backend is a much, at least for me, is a much easier to reason about and more elegant architectural design anyway than having my UI layer and my front end layer mixed in the same app with my backend and my APIs. I find just thinking about things kind of gets clarified when I separate those two things out. And then when you're separating them out, at that point, you might as well look at static generation for the front end if you're in that model anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. There was something you said, but I completely forgot it because what you did was you covered just about what I was about to say. So I'm not going to sit here and waffle on and try to come up with an interesting point to make. But you're absolutely right. If you're using that Jamstack idea of talking to a third-party API, that's what I was going to say. I feel like separating your UI and the generation of the UI and putting that somewhere else, and the hosting of that UI, and having your API or APIs separately, well, that's the S in Solid. That's separation of concerns, right? My API lives over here, and my UI lives over here. There's a contract there. That's an interface for .NET developers, right?
Well, and I think particularly in the .NET world where we're so used to this kind of MVC model where we're building these very thick client apps, once you start looking around at what third-party service providers and APIs exist out there, it's a little bit of like a mind-exploding moment when you think about how you can leverage some of that. I've seen some very, very cool, very dynamic Jamstack websites built that use something like Google Sheets for their for their quote unquote backend API. Mm-hmm. They stick all the data up in a Google Sheet and then query that using JavaScript to get the data that they need to show on the site. And it's beautiful. You can go in, as an editor, you go into the Google Doc and you edit whatever data you need. It's immediately reflected on the clients because they're pulling from that in real time. Because that work is distributed to each of the client browsers using JavaScript. There's no load balancing issues. You don't have to worry about the server overloading. So there's a lot of API-enabled services out there that are just waiting to be used as data sources and information sources for Jamstack style websites.
Sure. And Ali, I feel like we're just going to sit and agree for the next 5-10 minutes. Because, I feel like using a third-party API in a Jamstack situation, it removes the risk. So risk is probably not the right word. The responsibility, you said there about load balancing, right? Let's say I want to use identity over an API. I don't have to store anything about my users, which means that if I somehow manage to get hacked, there's nothing about my users in my code base, which means, from a regulatory standpoint, I don't have to worry about being hacked, right? The only thing I have to worry about is perhaps if the tokens get shared. And if the tokens are shared, you would hope that, as a developer, you'd hope that I'd set them up with a short lifespan anyway. So, an hour, 2 hours, maximum sort of thing. So
yeah, and even things like authentication, there's services for that, right? You can go to Auth0 or Okta or any of the number of services out there to do that. Let alone doing things like social logins and just letting other third parties kind of handle that for you. So yeah, I mean, these days there is a hosted service for literally anything you could think of. Now, an argument could be made that using 10 hosted services and patching them together is perhaps more complicated than doing it yourself in your own web server, and that's certainly a kind of a personal preference thing. For me, I want as much off my plate as I can get. And so any kind of infrastructure I don't have to maintain, any additional API endpoints I can eliminate, any code I don't have to write, all of that from my perspective is a improvement to quality of life and lets me focus on the parts that I do need to build.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if you're like a solo developer working on a single project, there's going to be a team of people at this other API you're poking into whose job it is to maintain it. And so they will have 20, 30, 40 more people than you.
Yeah, and secure it and make it fast and, and. Yeah, absolutely. Why not leverage those people who are doing that on your behalf?
Absolutely. It's like if you were to walk through a car manufacturing plant, you go to a Toyota or a Nissan or I don't think there's that many. I mean, that's kind of the whole point, isn't it? I don't think there's that many left in America. But if you were to go to a car manufacturing plant, you would probably find that the cars that are being manufactured, it might be a Toyota you're looking at, but it might have a Ford engine in it, right? Because they've relied on Ford to put the engine together in such a way that it makes sense. And so sometimes, you just grab the bits, not necessarily off the shelf, but grab the other bits that people have made just because they have the that expert knowledge, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So I feel like we've talked a whole bunch about Jamstack so far. And I feel like we've talked a little bit about how that differs to sort of like a standard ASP.NET MVC website. But what about, and I've heard this phrase and I love it, the BAM stack, which is Blazor APIs and markup. How does that, there's almost just like a semantic difference, isn't there, between BAM and Jam, right? Because
so
that one letter.
I'm glad you brought up Blazor because Blazor is very, very interesting in terms of just a raw product. I love the experimentation going on there, but also in terms of how it contrasts to kind of our traditional Jamstack. If going back 2 years to the invention of Jamstack is traditional, tech moves fast. So Blazor kind of operates in a few different modes, right? I mean, there's the server side Blazor mode where it creates this open pipe and sends DOM updates and rendering commands to the client from a server. That is absolutely not Statiq or Jamstack or anything, right? You need a heavy server that is kind of almost mirroring the client's browser in this stateful manner that knows what that browser is seeing and can compute the differences in the DOM to send down to light it up and make it change the way you want to. Nothing wrong with that mode, and I think it's just brilliant the way it works and the ideas and architecture behind it. But that's not what we're here to talk about, right? We're here to talk about statically generated things and Jamstack and BAMstack. So when we talk about Blazor in static generation contexts. What we're talking about is the client-side Blazor mode. And that's the mode where the .NET Blazor compiler will take your Blazor application and create a assembly from it, and then also create and output a bunch of bootstrapping stuff that includes some JavaScript files that help initialize WebAssembly, that load up the .NET runtime, and then that load your Blazor assembly into memory on the browser. Now, I just said a bunch of like really buzzwords there. So if anyone's not familiar with it, what's happening here, kind of in a less buzzwordy sense, is that there's this technology that exists inside browsers now that can run kind of arbitrary computer code, right? We've always been able to run JavaScript in the browser, kind of as far back as there were browsers. And JavaScript is a specific language, and you write it and it shows up in text. It gets sent as text, usually down to the browser. The browser reads it, compiles it, and runs it, right? And that's kind of the model we've always had. But now there's this thing called WebAssembly, and the idea is that we're gonna swap out that piece of JavaScript that does the work and replace it with, or add alongside it, a little virtual machine that can read and understand machine code, almost like assembly code. They call it WebAssembly. And so when we do that, the idea is essentially the same. I want to send some kind of logic, some kind of programming code to the browser. But instead of that code having to be JavaScript, I can now send it code that came from any language that is at a kind of a lower level, and this WebAssembly thing that lives inside the user's browser knows what to do with it and can run it. So kind of coming back to Blazor, in this client-side mode of Blazor, the .NET compiler takes your Blazor app, compiles it all into a standard .NET assembly, and then rigs up the extra stuff so that a client's web browser using this WebAssembly bit that's in there can load up the .NET runtime and then load up your Blazor app from its assembly and run that directly in the browser. So in a lot of ways, it's not all that different conceptually from sending down a JavaScript file to the browser, right? You've got myapp.js. That's pretty typical with SPA applications, for example. This is kind of like that. It's just instead of .js, it's a bunch of .wasm and .dll files. And so when you start thinking about it that way, your Blazor app becomes your statically generated application. So I think it's funny, we talk about how, and we'll talk about static in a few minutes, and how that's a static generator for .NET. But it's easy to forget that .NET now already has a static generator. It just happens that the static generator that's built into the platform is built around this sort of WebAssembly technology.
Yeah. It's an interesting time for technology for sure. And like you say, it's about using the tool that's in the toolbox that fits the solution best. Because like no tool will fit the solution perfectly, because that's how development works, right? And so
like you said, BAM versus JAM, it's the same thing. We're just swapping out the JavaScript parts for Blazor parts, but we still have to make API calls from the client because now we're living on the client. We're not living behind the firewall on your web server somewhere. We're living on the client, and that is the context from which everything is happening. So we still have to make API calls to get data. We still have to get the markup that kind of hosts our Blazor app and bootstraps everything. We can use third-party APIs just like we could from a JavaScript context. We could call our own APIs just like we could when JavaScript was on the front end. So in the BAM stack, you're essentially just swapping out JavaScript for C# or .NET code.
Yeah, definitely. I feel as though it's something that you haven't mentioned yet, but I feel as though it needs to sort of be mentioned, is because obviously you're pulling down the .NET DLL that the Blazor compilation process has created for your app. It has to pull that down, and the supporting libraries, and the runtime, right? So whilst it's a static app in the same sense that it's been generated ahead of time, I feel like my personal preference is still to use Jamstack, because BAMStack requires this huge amount of data to be downloaded to your browser. Now, admittedly, once it's downloaded, it's cached. So there's only that one-time hit of downloading 17 megabytes of DLLs, 18 megabytes of DLLs, 11.9 megabytes if you're using JSON.NET. So, there's a huge amount of data to pull down. Depending on
I know the team keeps working on things like tree shaking to remove code that you're not using from that compilation. But yeah, it's going to be big. The .NET runtime is big. It's a toolbox thing, right? I mean, even within the concept of statically generated apps, we're kind of narrowing down into which kind of static generation is appropriate for which use case. A Blazor app may be the perfect answer for that line of business app that you want to deliver to your global business user base through CDNs on the edge, but that everyone is kind of on, maybe they're on Azure VNets, and so they're close to the source, and downloading 20 megs to the web browser in their VM that's on the same network is not a big deal. But downloading 20 megabytes of website to someone in Sydney, Australia, may be a bigger deal. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of, trade-offs are everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you're shipping a device that is having this app on it, you could preload the app and the runtime and everything. Just to do that, you do that request once whilst it's in your data center, in your manufacturing plant, and then you send it out, and then the updates will be small, right? Because it only needs to pull down every time you push up an update to the code. It's only really going to be your code that changes, and so the 2-3 megabytes of code that you've written that has then been tree shaken will be downloaded, right? The runtime won't be re-downloaded, and your supporting libraries, unless they change, won't be re-downloaded. So if you can do that, take that hit of preloading it onto a machine before you send it out, but then, if you're doing something on the web, you're not preloading it on a machine like in a kiosk and giving someone the app, are you?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's walk away from ASP.NET for the time being, because we spent a lot of time on that. So I happen to know that there are a couple of different static website generators. And we'll come on to this in a minute, but Statiq doesn't just do websites, right? It can statically generate a whole bunch of stuff. I'm kind of giving something away for the listeners.
You're ruining you're bearing the lead. You're ruining the surprise. We'll get there.
Little tease, keep them interested. Because, my voice is so boring and laconic. But yeah, so I know that there's Jekyll, Hugo, Gatsby. Those are 3 of the big ones. And obviously Statiq makes it 4 of the big ones. But okay, so I know that Hugo uses the Go programming language, but you don't have to do any programming to get it working. Jekyll and Gatsby are JavaScript based, and you have to pull I'm not going to make the joke, but you have to pull a gigabyte of JavaScript dependencies to build it, because you got to do npm install.
Yeah, well, Jekyll's actually Ruby, which is like, if you think npm install is bad, getting the runtime up for Jekyll is kind of notoriously difficult. I mean, it's not that bad, but it's a whole separate tool chain that someone like a .NET developer may not have on their machine and readily available.
If you're enjoying this show, would you mind sharing it with a friend or colleague? Check out Podcatcher for a link to the show notes, which has an embedded player within it and a transcription and all that stuff, and share that link with them. I'd really appreciate it if you could indeed share the show. But if you'd like a few other ways to support it, you could leave a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. So if you head over to .netcore.show/review, you'll find loads of ways to do that. You could consider buying the show a coffee. The Buy Me a Coffee link is available on each show's show notes page on the website. This is a one-off financial support option. You could become a patron. This is a monthly subscription-based financial support option, and the link to that is included on each episode's show notes page as well. I'd love it if you could share the show with a friend or colleague, or leave a rating or review. The other options are completely up to you, and are not required at all to continue enjoying the show. Anyway, let's get back to it. So, okay, with Statiq being .NET, why would... I hate the why question, right? Because it always comes across as really aggressive. But I'm trying to say this in a little floaty way. Why would I use Statiq instead of Jekyll or Hugo or Gatsby or...
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. It's a good one. Why does this thing even exist in the world, right? I mean, people undertake open source projects for a variety of reasons. Some are to learn, which is kind of how Statiq started in its previous form 6 years ago now. Gosh, it's hard to believe it's been that long. And some are kind of started to fill a gap in functionality or feature set, which is kind of the second reason I started working on static generators. So why this project? Why does it exist in the world? And the answer is really twofold, and both reasons are kind of equally important. The first is that I know Razor, and I like Razor. And when I build a website, I want to use Razor. But I also really, really like static generation and have way before Statiq was even a glimmer in my eye. I really like the concept. I like how much it removes off my plate, right? You get to a point when you have just too much to do. We can't build all the things we want to build. And so any tool or any concept that eliminates things from my stuff I need to worry about bucket is kind of vastly interesting to me. And so static site generation immediately fills that kind of thought process because it removes this entire class of web app problem in terms of setting up a web server, deploying it, and all that you just don't need to think about anymore. Uptime, making sure it doesn't go down. The number of times before I really got into statically generated websites that, I would get an alert at 9 p.m. at night or 10 p.m., as I'm trying to enjoy my evening, that my web server is suddenly offline. I haven't seen one of those in 6 years. Mm-hmm. That was kind of the first itch. I like static generation as a concept, but I like .NET and in particular Razor as a templating language. And at the time, there was no way to marry the two. So I set out to make a way of turning Razor templates, and particularly Razor layouts, into websites without having a web server involved. But the kind of second reason, that probably would not have been enough alone to keep me going as long as the project has been going. What really kind of turns it into a bit more than just turning Razor into HTML is I looked around and did not see the kind of static generator in any language that I would want to use. And what I mean by that is most static generators are, in particular, static website generators, and their entire purpose is to take a set of markdown files along with a layout written in whatever language du jour that particular platform supports. Sometimes it's handlebars, sometimes it's mustache, sometimes it's liquid, which I really like. But it's to take markdown files and these layouts and turn them into HTML, and maybe do some other stuff to your resources, like minify your JavaScript, or nowadays they've gotten a little more sophisticated and can do things like making JavaScript bundles and calling out to Webpack and Yarn and things like that. But they're entirely focused around this single concept of turning web stuff into static web stuff, which is fine, and Statiq can do that too. But what I did not see was a way to sort of easily introduce or augment that process with other processes that can get data from different places and produce data in different ways. What I mean by that is, let's say you have, as an example, a set of content sitting in a SQL database somewhere. Maybe that's got your blog posts in the database, or maybe it's got a database of products and prices. With most of the existing static generators, at least at the time, pulling from those kinds of resources and using that data in the pursuit of building your statically generated web app was difficult. I mean, you could do it by writing a lot of code, but they weren't really designed to do that. So Statiq is kind of my answer to that problem. It's how do you build a static site generator that can do, the happy path is easy. It can do the same stuff that your Jekyll or your Hugo can do without really any effort on the part of the developer. But, we're .NET developers, so we want to tinker, right? That's kind of Microsoft's whole ethos, and we kind of inherit it as .NET developers, right? So as a .NET developer, I want to tinker with this. I want to introduce things. I want to use this as a toolkit to build my own static generator that can pull data from wherever it needs to pull data from, that can mix and match data however it needs to, that can splice data up and mix it together, and do all those things in a way that is kind of easy to think about and visualize. So that is really the sort of, I hate to use the word marketing because I'm not marketing to anyone, but that's the marketing pitch, right? That's the elevator pitch. It's a static generator that is designed mostly for developers as a toolkit to build your own static generation capabilities that do whatever you need them to do. That's turned out to be pretty powerful, right? I mean, bloggers use Statiq. We've got lots of people using it for their blogs, and they don't really tweak it at all. They add the 5 or 6 lines of boilerplate code to their app, and they're ready to go, and they never touch the app again, and they just use it to generate a blog from their markdown. And that's totally fine. But when you want to go beyond that, it's designed to be familiar and robust enough to do so.
Okay, so what kind of things are we talking then? So you said, that Hugo, Gatsby, etc., they're all really good at taking this content which exists on disk in a form that it knows about and creating essentially a website from it, right? A bunch of HTML, a whole bunch of hierarchical HTML with links everywhere and filling all that data in. But what can I do with Statiq then? I know I sort of I teased a little earlier on, and you've said it a few times, but like you said, one of the things you can do is create a blog, create an HTML website. What else can I do with it, right?
Yeah, so a great example of the class of problem that's kind of solved by this is some of the work that's been done by folks at both Contigo and Contentful. Both of those are CMS services, sometimes called headless CMSs. The idea being that they're a content management system that has no front end. It's got no web app that a user hits. Think about it, a good metaphor would be like WordPress, but without the WordPress site, just the admin interface. That's the idea behind a headless CMS. And these headless CMSs are popping up everywhere. It's a fantastic model because what it does is, again, it helps separate these concerns, and it makes it easy to author and maintain content and resources both by the developer, but more importantly, by non-developers, maybe your marketing team, maybe your business users, whoever. It provides nice interfaces for those people to come in and work on the content of your site in an admin interface. And then it provides that content through APIs, right? So again, this is getting into APIs involved in the static site world. But in this case, it's a little bit different flavor because we're reading the APIs at generation time as opposed to at runtime using JavaScript from the client. In this case, we're going to go out and our static generator is going to go talk to these APIs while it's generating the site. And when it's talking to these APIs, it can pull down that content that was written inside of that headless CMS. So there's already, like I said, there's two really great proof of concepts out there that are in use today. Contigo has kind of really done a fantastic job going down that road. They even have their own little microsite that we'll add to the show notes that sort of demonstrates how to mix a headless CMS with static. Contentful also has some work out there doing the same. And because, kind of coming back to the original question, because static is designed for this kind of thing, mixing in your own headless CMS, whatever service you're using with static by making those API calls within your static app it is relatively straightforward. You make the calls, maybe using that company's .NET API, maybe just using normal RESTful web calls through an HTTP client. You make those calls, you get the data, you tell static to use this data going forward, and then downstream bits can pick that up and run with it. So maybe you feed that data into a Razor layout, and now all of a sudden, the pages you made inside your headless CMS get spit out by static as HTML files wrapped in your Razor layout. So that's a fantastic kind of case in point there. But there's others. For example, the speaker directory of the .NET Foundation website uses static. And in that case, speakers create their profiles as YAML files inside the .NET Foundation GitHub repo. And the YAML file defines the speaker's name, their web link, some detail information, their image if they want one. And then every time something new gets committed to that repo, GitHub Actions goes out, runs static, rebuilds the .NET Foundation website, and updates all of these statically generated resources that power the speaker directory. So when you're browsing the speaker directory on the .NET Foundation website, you're looking at a set of statically generated resources, including a JavaScript file in the backend that's powering the display and filtering. That was all generated on every commit by GitHub Actions and immediately updated each time the site is updated automatically. So yeah, there's a lot that you can do when you kind of unshackle what the static generator is capable of. And in keeping in mind with the fact that we're .NET developers and we're probably all familiar with ASP.NET as a platform, static tries to follow the same patterns. The Fluent configuration should be familiar to anyone who's ever worked with a, ASP.NET Core startup file. The dependency injection uses the inbox.NET dependency injection container. Logging uses the built-in .NET logging stuff. So it's designed to feel familiar, and to I always try and keep in mind, what would a static generator look like if the ASP.NET team were to build one? And that's kind of what the user experience I'm going after is.
Right, okay. So let's talk about how I use it then, right? I'm coming at this conversation from specifically from the static generation side of it, from having used Hugo. Just a look behind the scenes. The website for the .NET Core podcast is built by Hugo. The website for Waffling Tailors, which is another website, another podcast that I work on, built by Hugo. Tabs and spaces are built by Gatsby. So there's a couple of different, but my understanding of how all they work is, okay, so you download a thing, and then you point that thing at all your content, and a website comes out the other end. So I'm downloading static.exe, right?
No, so you asked the exact perfect question. It's a little, we're playing baseball here. You did the pitch. Now I'm gonna knock it into the stands. No, you don't download static exec. There is no static exec. There is no application to run. There's not even a .NET tool. Static is a framework, which means that you include it in your own application, in your own console app. So you make a console app, you import these static NuGet packages, depending on whether you want the kind of lower level framework or you want some additional capabilities layered on top of that for things like websites or even API documentation. You bring in those packages, and then you write, at a minimum, I think it's down to like 2 or 3 lines of code in the entry point to your console app. And those 2 or 3 lines of code bootstrap the whole thing. So in that sense, it's not unlike creating a ASP.NET Core website, right? You create a console app, and there's a little bit of bootstrapping code in there to rig up the web host and get it going. This is kind of similar. But what that does for you is, even though the kind of basic level static app those are all going to look exactly the same. They're going to have the exact same 3 lines of code. But because you've got those 3 lines of code and you've got that app, now it kind of encourages and makes it easy to add more, to do more. You want to change settings. Maybe you want to change the title of the site. You can do that using configuration files, but you can also do it straight in your code. There's all kinds of stuff that you can do now that you've got that kind of Fluent bootstrapper in your startup method.
Right, okay. So you're talking about how it's a NuGet package, you pull it in, it creates this almost like like you say, a Fluent readable API as you read through it. I hit F5, out pops my content. And because you mentioned
so there's different flavors of static, right? So there's static framework, which is a very low level thing, which has all of the building blocks. Think of it as your set of Legos. Hopefully you don't get sued for my use of a trademark term here. But your static framework is your static generation Legos, and you can pick and choose whatever blocks you want for the kind of generator you're trying to build, but nothing is built for you. You're getting a box of unconnected Legos. So if you create an app using static framework and don't do anything else but set up the bootstrapper and hit go, nothing will happen. I mean, it'll run, but it'll tell you I didn't do anything because you didn't tell me what to do.
Right.
So Static Framework is very good for scenarios where you want the most amount of control. You don't want extra stuff or fluff. Let's say all you want to do is turn 5 markdown files into HTML. You don't need anything more than another 5 or 6 lines of code in Static Framework to do that. So that would be a good choice for that scenario. But you have to do the building. You can even use it to do things that are completely unrelated to web apps. We use it. I've seen it used as a build tool or an orchestration tool because at its core, Static operates on this concept of pipelines and pipeline dependencies, and it helps with ordering and concurrency and concerns like that. So that's Static Framework. Now, if you want it to do some stuff out of the box without writing code, now we're into a layer sitting on top called Static Web. And Static Web takes all those Lego bricks and assembles them for you into a set of, I think there's 8 or 9 pipelines that are in there and do different things. What do some of those do? Well, some of them convert your markdown to HTML. Some of them create archives, think tag listings or by date archives, that kind of thing. Some of them go through and read YAML and JSON files and make that available to your pages as they're being generated. Some of them minify your resources. So there's these set of kind of pre-built features and pipelines that come along with Static Web. So if you want to write a blog, for example, you can import the Static Web NuGet package, write your 3 lines of bootstrapping code, and now instead of having nothing to start with, you've got an entire static generator that is not dissimilar from Hugo or Gatsby or Jekyll or Eleventy or whichever, ready to go. And it's now kind of in your app. And you can still augment that, change it, modify it with your own code and pipelines, just like you could with Framework. But the groundwork is done for you if you're working on websites. And then even a layer on top of that is a project called Static Docs, which does everything Static Web does and adds support for reading C# source files or assemblies and creating API documentation from those. Think kind of like Sandcastle. So there's different flavors of Static that layer on additional functionality depending on how much you want done for you versus how much you want to do yourself.
Okay. So, left field question based on what you just said. Can Static document itself if you throw in Static?
The static.dev API section is generated by Static.
Excellent.
It is self-documenting. It is not quite as scary as self-aware, but still a little scary.
I like it. Now that's always been something that's been difficult for me in previous years when I'm working with a client or back when I was a permanent employee, when it was like, right, how are we going to document how this works? And someone's been like, yeah, well, we'll just put loads of XML documentation in it. And then, you just have to pull the code and read through it. And I'm like, okay, that's great. But what if you're not a .NET developer and you want to know how our API works? And this was back in the days before Swagger and OpenAPI. And they were like, yeah, what we'll do is we'll put XML documents in it. And then what you need to do is you need to pull the code and read it. I'm like, well, you just said exactly the same thing twice. It doesn't solve the problem.
Yeah, so Static Docs was built kind of to scratch this itch I had where I looked around and there really wasn't a good modern option for .NET API documentation. There's Sandcastle, which still works, and it's still a good tool. I used the heck out of it back in the day, But I didn't feel like it was flexible enough for modern .NET documentation sites, at least the kind of sites I wanted to build, to kind of mix in one platform to mix the API docs with my content and kind of have those cross-referenced and linking back and forth and things like that. You see a Sandcastle site, which looks fantastic, but most of the time when you see that kind of generated documentation, there's a few other tools that work similarly. You're on the site and then you hit the API link in the nav bar, and whoa, all of a sudden you're on like a completely different site, and there's no continuity between the two. So I didn't love that, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to kind of get API documentation generation in here, because I felt like that was a missed opportunity to have your guidance, your plain language documentation, and the API documentation living in the same sort of universe. And now we also have DocFX, which is a fantastic project. And I think those folks are doing great work. But as a project, it's tailored towards powering the Microsoft documentation. And so there's trade-offs there. I mean, that is the team's focus. So powering arbitrary .NET projects is not really their core focus and constituency. And it shows a little bit in the on-ramp. So it's very similar. DocFX is very similar to Statiq docs in terms of conceptual, the way that they go about things and the thinking there. The experience, though, is a little bit different. And that's not to say one is better than the other. And they both have strengths and weaknesses. But, I looking around, it was like, well, shoot, I have all these open source projects, and I really want to easily generate API documentation for them. And I've got this static generator I've been working on. What's an open source developer to do? And the answer is, always, I'll make a new open source project until you've got, 10 of those on the back burner that you're never going to get to. Thankfully, I got to this one, and now it's available for your use.
Excellent. Okay. So since you said, and here's another curveball based on what you've just said, right? I hope I'm using the baseball analogies correctly there, by the way.
I know. A little bit of a talk about localization. Yeah.
But, you said that Statiq is based on this idea of pipelines and this fluent API chaining things together. Thought experiment. Would it be possible for Statiq not just to document .NET libraries, but maybe to look at a JavaScript library and document that, or a suite of, say, Ruby gems, or, if someone could write the code that inspects those binaries, inspects the documentation, could Statiq just swap that Lego piece over and, hey, we've just documented a JavaScript library, or we've just documented a Java library or something?
Yeah, absolutely. That would be a fair amount of work because there's kind of two sides to API documentation. There's the semantic modeling, which is understanding what the code looks like, what it contains, the control flows. In .NET, we have Roslyn, which is, just a gift from Microsoft to all of us. It is fantastic. So we really have a head start in that regard. There are similar semantic analysis tools for other platforms. They don't necessarily integrate with .NET, though. So Statiq has modules that help with that, too. There is one particularly powerful module whose entire job is to shell out and start a new process and then either let it run or watch it or wait for it to send information back. That acts as kind of a glue between what's going on inside your .NET app that's running Statiq and the rest of the universe. So we have users who, for example, use that to launch Webpack when they start to build their website, or launch Tailwind, the Tailwind compiler. Or, you can launch whatever arbitrary stuff you want to launch with that. So with that piece as glue, you could see a world where you go off and launch some semantic analysis tool. And maybe you even find one in the .NET world. Maybe there's an assembly out there on NuGet that knows how to read and parse, say, Ruby code, and can spit out a semantic model for you to use. However you get it, the first step is getting that semantic model, right? So Statiq helps in that sense by kind of providing the framework in which you can make that work happen in the right order. And so once you've got that semantic model, now the sort of second part of that problem is how do I spit HTML out from that? So the theme that Statiq Docs ships with is sort of heavily dependent on Roslin's view of the world. It essentially has a bunch of razor files that take the static representation of the symbols that Roslin produces for .NET code, and turns them into bits on the page, so that you have this beautiful API documentation that lists your symbols and your methods and your properties and the documentation for that. So any effort to document some other language would need to have a different set of layout files that are kind of appropriate for the kind of information that semantic analysis piece produces. So that's how you would glue things together. Now, the good news is that doing that kind of gluing together and making those kinds of completely arbitrary, we never would have thought of it ourselves, sorts of things happen within your static generator is exactly what Statiq was built to enable. So I would venture to say that to do that would take some work, but the work you're doing would be almost entirely focused on that specific problem, parsing and analyzing JavaScript code and producing a good theme and output from it, and not at all on the problem of how do I fit this into my static generation process, which if you were to do it in pretty much any other static generator, that second part, which Statiq kind of removes from you by making it easy, would be a good chunk of your effort trying to figure out, well, how do I get 11D to go out and run this arbitrary code that reads JavaScript and analyzes it and produces output that I can then use in my layout? I would have no idea where to begin with that. I'm sure there's some 11D wizards who could figure it out. But Statiq is designed specifically to answer those kinds of questions.
Okay. I mean, yeah, that's like I said, it was a thought experiment, bit of a curveball. See, and it sounds like like you said, the difficult bit of displaying it and how do I put this into my static generation bit is taken care of. The domain problem of reading a binary or a library or some code by some other thing, that's the bit that you would focus on, right? You said that, right? So let's say I go away and I write, for 6 months, I write a way to read JavaScript code in .NET and parse it and figure it all out and create the ultimate way to dissect JavaScript code in .NET. And I create a couple of pages that describe the theme. I just literally plug that into Statiq and give it a binary or give it some code, and it should just, right? Thought experiment, it should just work. I'm not saying
and ideally
yes or no, right?
Everything. So Statiq is also built to be very modular. So ideally, everything is built in such a way that, if one wanted to, it could be released as a project in its own right, as a static extension, and then used by the community. And from that point forward, anyone could produce documentation for their JavaScript library using Statiq right alongside all the other stuff they're doing in Statiq. A great example of this kind of thing there are several open issues that I just haven't gotten to yet. To do something similar for Swagger, or I guess now it's Open API documentation, to look through a set of endpoints or a Open API spec and produce, statically generate a nice, web site that documents that Open API spec. That's a perfect example of where Statiq kind of comes in and is ideal for that job. And once that work happens, once that the code is written to create a module that can read an Open API spec and produce appropriate static documents for that, and a theme is written that can take those documents and turn them into nice looking HTML, that then becomes available for everyone. So that, that's the dream, that's the hope. So yeah, I mean, having Statiq document other kinds of programmatic artifacts is definitely sort of in the realm of things we think about.
Cool. Okay. So what I'll say, Dave, is we're coming up on the end of our time together. I'd love to have you back and talk a lot more about this, because there's so much more that we could talk about. If you're interested in coming back and talking to the listeners more, because this is just it's a topic which is just so open for discussion, and there's something that I've got in our notes that people talk about static websites is not changeable, and it's like, well, yeah, but I got zero downtime. I don't have to do Kubernetes, Docker, microservices, something scalable, something alphabet soup, and huge amounts of complicated technology to do that. But I feel like we could probably park that conversation, whet everyone's appetite, and maybe if you're interested, we can come back and talk about that.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So everyone, you heard it here. Sit tight for part 2 coming to a podcast near you at some point in the future.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, no, that's great. That would be wonderful to do, because I think there's a great conversation about that, about how most developers leap towards the complicated first, because maybe we've been I can't think of the word, but we've been sort of like conditioned. That's probably the wrong word to use, but it feels like it's kind of rightish. We've been conditioned to leap towards the most complicated solution possible, and then build that. And it's like, well, no, because like the website's a static website, right? It's just HTML. You don't need anything more than that. But yeah, let's whet the listeners' appetite and come back to that as another conversation if you're interested.
Yeah,
if you're
totally,
interested, Dave. Awesome, because yeah, I feel like that's something that we could talk about. But yeah, before we go though, what about if you let the listeners know maybe how they can get in contact with you, maybe like if you're on Twitter or whatever, where they can discover Statiq and learn more about it. And I'll make sure to collect a whole bunch of links from you and put them in the show notes, so then people can just click that, right? And just, there's Dave. Click that. Oh, brilliant, that's Statiq.
Yeah, sure. So the main place you can find me is hanging out on Twitter. I am at Dave A. Glick on Twitter. Same thing on GitHub and really anywhere else you might find that handle. It's probably me. You can find Statiq at Statiq with a Q .dev. That is the main Statiq website, and then it has links off to GitHub and has the guide, has the API. So that's a good starting point for learning about Statiq.
Excellent. Well, like I said, Dave, it's been an amazing chat with you. I had a wonderful. So really quick, looking behind the curtains, we do a discovery call first, and we ended up talking for like almost 2 hours just in the discovery call. I remember that. That was a load of fun, and this has been a load of fun too.
Yeah, I think maybe we touched on the first 15% of possible topics here. Yeah,
absolutely. But that, that's because you're a very interesting guy, and it's a very interesting topic. And let's come back again and do it again and cover some more points if you're interested. Excellent. Well, thank you ever so much for being on the show, Dave. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. And I know I've learned a whole bunch of stuff. I'm sure the listeners will too. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And if anyone listening to this has questions as you're listening, go ahead. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. That's kind of what I monitor the most. And I'm happy to answer or just discuss some of this stuff with anyone who's interested.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dave. That was my interview with Dave Glick. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .netcore.show/review for ways to do that. Reach out via our contact page. That's at .netcore.show/contact. And to come back next time for more .NET goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.